The barn had always been my refuge from solitude until one evening when a simple moment with our horse took an unforeseen turn, leaving me to reconsider everything I believed about trust, limits, and my own emotions. It might sound unusual, but I must admit it began innocently, or at least that's what I told myself initially. My husband was away on another work trip, and the house felt oppressively quiet and void. In search of solace, I wandered to the barn as I had countless times before. Apollo, our stunning chestnut gelding, had always been a soothing presence, a source of tranquility in my otherwise monotonous existence. But that night, something felt different, a subtle shift I couldn't fully articulate. In the stillness of the barn, I crossed a boundary I never imagined I would, a line that blurred my understanding of loyalty, trust, and my identity. Our relationship, my husband's and mine, was one built on routine, predictability, and comfort. He worked long hours at his corporate job, frequently traveling, while I stayed home. Our shared life was a tapestry of ordinary moments, quiet dinners, uneventful weekends, and evenings spent in front of the television. Yet beneath the surface, there was an indefinable void. Over time, the distance between us grew, and I found myself turning to the companionship of our horse. We had always kept horses on our property, a secluded patch of land far from the bustling city, a sanctuary where we could exhale. The barn was meticulously maintained, and the field stretched like a serene haven. While my husband found peace in caring for the horses, they were merely a pastime to him. For me, however, these animals represented a profound connection, an escape from the monotony of daily life. Visiting the barn became my solace during my husband's absences. Feeding the horses, brushing their coats, and simply being in their company brought a sense of comfort. That was how it all began, a connection I never anticipated. The first time I entered the barn alone during one of my husband's trips, the air was brisk, filled with the earthy aroma of hay. Apollo, the majestic gelding with his lustrous chestnut coat shimmering in the sunlight streaming through the barn windows, stood in his stall. His soulful brown eyes seemed to regard me with curiosity. Though he had always been my husband's horse, that day I felt an inexplicable pull toward him, a connection that took me by surprise. Hesitant at first, I lingered by the stall door, simply observing him. Slowly, I stepped closer, speaking to him softly, as though he might understand. Apollo responded with an unspoken trust, as if sensing the vulnerability I had kept hidden, mirroring it back to me. Days turned into weeks, and I spent increasing amounts of time with Apollo. Each interaction brought a calming reprieve from the emptiness I felt. Grooming him, cleaning his hooves, and simply sitting in the barn became my quiet escape. Riding him offered a liberating sense of freedom, an exhilarating journey where the weight of the world seemed to vanish. However, one day, something shifted. It was subtle, just a quiet moment in the barn after an afternoon ride. As I untacked Apollo, I found myself reluctant to leave. Running my hands over his sleek coat, I felt a warmth that extended beyond our bond, a sensation I couldn't ignore. He leaned into my touch, and in that instant, an undeniable energy sparked between us. The connection grew deeper, entangling my emotions in ways I hadn't foreseen. While I tried to suppress the feelings, they lingered, surfacing each time I returned to the barn. The nights alone in the house became colder and more isolating, and I found myself drawn back to Apollo's presence, a connection that both comforted and unsettled me in equal measure. I would sit quietly, listening to the wind outside, waiting for my husband to return. Yet, even when he was home, the gap between us seemed to grow. I couldn't communicate with him the way I could with Apollo. He didn't understand my silence or my needs, but Apollo did, effortlessly without a word. One night, after an especially exhausting day, I found myself in the barn once more, unable to resist the pull. I had tried to fight it, tried to focus on other things, but the ache in my chest had become unbearable. Apollo was there, waiting for me. I approached him without hesitation, without second-guessing myself. The barn was dimly lit, the only illumination coming from the soft glow of moonlight streaming through the cracks in the walls. Apollo stood there, calm and steady, as though he had been expecting me all along. I could feel his unwavering gaze on me. For a moment, I simply stood there, taking in the cool night air and trying to steady my racing heart. Then it happened. I can't pinpoint what led to it, but as I reached out to touch Apollo's mane, something changed between us. Our bond deepened, moving beyond mere emotion. In that instant, I knew I had crossed an invisible line. I stepped back, my heart pounding in my chest. What was I doing? What had I done? Yet, even as panic gripped me, I couldn't ignore the truth. I didn't want to stop. I couldn't explain it. But at that moment, it felt as though Apollo and I shared something profound, something I couldn't walk away from. It didn't end there. That moment wasn't fleeting. It marked the beginning of something I couldn't escape. With each passing day, the connection grew stronger. And as my husband continued to travel for business, I found myself returning to the barn over and over again. This wasn't confusion. It was an undeniable need, a deep, visceral craving that grew with every visit. Apollo was no longer just a horse. He had become my secret, my sanctuary, my obsession. Even when I wasn't with him, his presence lingered. In my quiet, solitary moments, I would think of him. I would recall the way his coat shimmered in the sunlight and the way his muscles moved fluidly under his skin. I could almost feel the warmth radiating from him, the way he responded to me. The connection between us felt magnetic, drawing me closer no matter how much I tried to resist. It wasn't just the physical closeness that captivated me, it was the unspoken understanding between us. Apollo didn't need words to make me feel seen, understood, and wanted. Every touch, every glance we shared sent waves of heat coursing through me. I tried to convince myself that I was being foolish, that loneliness was driving me to this, but it was no use. I kept going back to the barn. It wasn't that my husband's absence created a void. I had plenty of ways to fill my time. I could have gone out with friends, rekindled hobbies, or even returned to work. But I didn't want any of that. I wanted Apollo. That night, after the shift in our bond, I couldn't sleep. My husband had returned from a week-long trip, and while I was glad to see him, I felt hollow. As he slept beside me, his steady breathing seemed to amplify the turmoil in my mind. Images of Apollo replayed in my head. The way he moved, the heat of his body. I slipped out of bed, careful not to disturb my husband, and found myself at the window, gazing at the barn in the moonlit distance. The conflict within me was unbearable. I stood at a crossroads between the life I had built with my husband and this strange magnetic force pulling me toward Apollo. Hours after leaving the barn, my body still tingled, my skin still alive with the memory of what had transpired. Returning to bed, I lay awake, listening to my husband's quiet breathing. The silence between us felt suffocating, and the love we had once shared seemed distant. He didn't deserve this. But at that moment, I couldn't bring myself to care. The next day, when my husband left for a meeting, I found myself drawn back to the barn once more. It was as though a force beyond my control was guiding me there. The bond between Apollo and me was impossible to resist, no matter how much I tried to bury it. And so I moved swiftly, knowing deep down that slowing down would only make it harder to face what I had become. I might pause, but I couldn't stop. Not now. I'd found Apollo waiting for me, just as he always did. His coat was glossy, his muscles rippling under his skin as he turned toward me. His gaze locked onto mine, and I swear I could see the same yearning in his eyes that stirred within me. I didn't speak. Words felt unnecessary now. I moved toward him, my breath shallow, my heart racing. My hands shook as I reached out to him, and the moment I touched his mane, a surge of energy coursed through me. I couldn't explain it. It was as though every nerve in my body awakened, every part of me attuned to him. He neighed softly, almost beckoning me closer, and I obeyed without hesitation. My fingers ran over his coat, the warmth of his body seeping into my hands. My skin tingled as if charged, the world outside the barn dissolving as my focus narrowed to him alone. I wasn't sure what came over me, but I didn't resist it. I couldn't resist. The barn was quiet, save for the gentle rhythm of Apollo's breathing and the soft rustle of his mane beneath my touch. The atmosphere between us grew heavy, almost tangible. I stepped nearer, pressing myself against his side, feeling the heat radiate from him. That warmth seemed to permeate me, and I found myself unable and unwilling to pull away. Apollo shifted, turning to nuzzle my neck, his breath warm against my skin. The sensation sent a shiver down my spine, a heat spreading through me that took me by surprise. I wanted more. Without thinking, I lifted my hand to caress his face, my fingers brushing against his lips. And then it happened. Apollo leaned closer, his nostrils flaring, and I swear I could feel his heartbeat synchronizing with mine. For a moment, time seemed to stand still, the outside world fading entirely. I couldn't pinpoint where the boundary blurred, but suddenly I wasn't just standing there. My body pressed against his, my hands exploring instinctively, feeling the taut muscles beneath his skin. I was consumed, utterly overtaken by the connection. My breath hitched as every fiber of my being screamed for something more, something beyond words. There was no going back now. And then, just as abruptly, reality hit me. My chest heaved, my breathing unsteady in the barn's silence. Apollo's warmth seemed to envelop every corner of the space, leaving me feeling bare and exposed. I stepped back, my heart pounding, my body trembling from the aftermath of what had just unfolded. One thing was clear. There was no reversing what had happened. The line I had crossed wasn't merely physical. It was etched into my mind and heart, a boundary erased. I couldn't stop thinking about it, the way my body reacted to Apollo, the way his presence consumed my senses. I tried to dismiss it as a fleeting lapse of reason, but it wasn't. The bond between us had deepened, and the harder I fought to suppress it, the more it consumed me. With my husband away again, I was left alone with my thoughts, and with Apollo. Even when my husband was home, I was absent, lost in a world where the barn and Apollo's presence dominated my mind. I made excuses to visit the barn daily, claiming I needed fresh air or solitude. The truth was, I needed Apollo more than anything else. There was an unrelenting pull between us, undeniable and magnetic. Every step into the barn felt like entering another world, a world where only Apollo and I existed, where the weight of expectations and obligations disappeared. But tonight, something was different. Apollo wasn't in his usual stall, waiting for me with his calm, understanding eyes. I called out his name, my voice soft yet urgent. He always answered me, but this time, there was only silence. Panic surged in me. Had something happened to him? I searched the barn, opening each stall door until I heard a faint whinny. Following the sound, I found him at the far end of the stable. He stood there, his head lowered, as if lost in thought. When he saw me, his eyes brightened, and he trotted toward me, his hooves striking a rhythmic beat on the barn floor. For a moment, I was paralyzed, watching him come closer. Then he reached me, gently nuzzling me with his nose as if to reassure me. I reached for his mane, my hands trembling with the overwhelming tide of emotions. His warmth seeped into me, and I closed my eyes, letting myself sink into the moment. I wasn't merely standing there. Something within me was shifting once again, a subtle longing, an undeniable urge I couldn't suppress. A shaky breath escaped me as my fingers gently trailed along his neck, feeling the taut muscles rippling beneath his skin with every movement. The closeness between us was unmistakable, the air thick with unspoken understanding. It felt as though the invisible distance separating us was dissolving, as though Apollo and I were becoming intertwined in a way that transcended the physical realm. I couldn't articulate it, but at that moment, it felt as if we were bound on a level I had never experienced before. The emotional connection between us had deepened so profoundly that it blurred the boundaries of where I ended and where Apollo began. He seemed to respond instinctively to every thought and emotion I projected, and in return, I became attuned to his every motion, his every breath. It was as though we communicated in silence, our mutual comprehension growing stronger with each passing second. I stepped closer, my hand tracing the contours of his side as I pressed my body gently against his. The warmth radiating from him dissolved any lingering uncertainty or hesitation within me. Words were unnecessary. There was only us, tied together by an unspoken bond. I had long ceased questioning why this was happening. There was no point in trying to rationalize it anymore. Apollo shifted slightly, aligning his chest against mine, and a rush of indescribable emotion surged through me. His breath brushed against my skin, warm and steady, as I closed my eyes and let the sensation wash over me. My fingers glided over his coat, the smoothness of his muscles beneath sending waves of heat coursing through me. My heartbeat quickened, the tension between us mounting with every fleeting moment. This connection wasn't just about physical closeness, though that was undeniable. It was the intensity of emotion, the sense of having discovered something that transcended the ordinary. Apollo was no longer merely an animal to me. He had become my equal, someone who understood me in ways no one else could, and in turn, I grasped the essence of him in ways no one else ever would. When his gaze locked with mine, an electric current surged between us, deepening our connection in a way that was both thrilling and unsettling. I could feel his vitality, his energy, as though it had become intertwined with my own. For a fleeting moment, I was no longer myself. I was us. My hands moved instinctively, pulling him closer, his body responding with a gentle yet insistent force that made my pulse race. Every fiber of his being seemed to burn with an intensity that mirrored my own yearning. He was no longer just a presence by my side. He was a part of me, as I was a part of him. I couldn't resist the pull any longer, the tension that had silently built between us over the past weeks now reaching its peak. But as swiftly as the fire ignited, something inside me recoiled. I stood trembling, my breath unsteady, as the weight of realization bore down on me. Guilt crashed over me like a tidal wave, a bitter shame that struck me to my core. What was I doing? What had I allowed myself to become? I pulled away from Apollo, my heart hammering in my chest. For a moment, I couldn't meet his gaze. The guilt, the fear, the sense that I had crossed an irreversible line was overwhelming. Stumbling backward, my hands shook as I wiped my face, trying to clear the fog clouding my mind. In the silence, Apollo remained still, watching me with those deep, knowing eyes, as if he could sense the turmoil raging inside me. I didn't know how to stop, how to undo the strange and tangled bond that had formed between us. And deep down, I knew I couldn't return to who I once was. That person was gone, replaced by someone else entirely, someone who had crossed a line they could never uncross. The most terrifying part was that I wasn't even sure I wanted to go back. I was spiraling, lost in a labyrinth with no escape, pulled deeper into Apollo's orbit with every passing moment. The guilt was suffocating at times, but in his presence, when he brushed against me or nuzzled my neck, it would dissipate, rendered insignificant by the magnetic force that bound us. With him, I forgot the life I had left behind, the promises I had made, the vows I had taken. With him, the world made sense in a way it never had before. Silent, unjudged, just us. Yet the tension kept rising, an undeniable truth gnawing at me. I couldn't live in this secret reality forever. I was caught in the chasm between maintaining the facade of normalcy and surrendering to the truth of what I had become. My marriage, my carefully constructed life, was crumbling beneath the weight of this unspoken bond. And as the days passed, the thin veneer of my old life grew more fragile, threatening to shatter entirely. I had managed to maintain appearances for some time, deceiving myself and deceiving him. When he returned from his trips, I pretended that everything was all right, but deep down, I knew he had started to notice something. Something in my eyes, a shift that couldn't be concealed any longer. I couldn't hide the way my body seemed to vibrate with energy whenever I was near Apollo, the way I would drift off, lost in thoughts that had nothing to do with my husband. One evening, my husband came to me, his face serious. He had been quiet for days, observing me from the corner of his eye with a gaze I couldn't decipher. The questions hung between us like a dense fog, suffocating everything in its path. He leaned against the doorframe, his eyes scanning mine. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice soft but filled with a disturbing calmness. I swallowed hard, my stomach twisting in knots. I had no clue how to respond. Part of me wanted to confess everything, the truth I had been concealing, the hidden world I had created with Apollo, the betrayal I had committed. But another part of me couldn't bring myself to shatter the illusion. "I don't know what you mean," I said, my voice sounding much more distant than I intended. I cursed myself for how my heart raced, for how my hands trembled, even just slightly. He studied me for a long while before pushing away from the doorframe. His gaze never left mine as he moved closer, his voice now lower, tinged with concern. "I've been giving you space, thinking you needed it. But this isn't you. You've been different." I had no answer. I felt like a stranger to myself, disconnected from the life I had once known. The woman I had been, the part of me that had once been his wife, seemed to have faded, lost in a world that no longer fit. "I've been fine," I finally said, forcing the words out, even though they felt like lies. Just a little stressed, but he wasn't convinced. He studied me for another moment, and then, almost as if he had made a decision, he turned and left the room without saying another word. The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear him downstairs, pacing in the kitchen, and I knew he was trying to figure it out, trying to put together the pieces of a puzzle he couldn't solve. I wanted to leave. I wanted to escape, to run to the barn and be with Apollo, where nothing mattered except the warmth of his body and the quiet between us. But I couldn't. Not yet. As the days grew colder, I retreated further into myself. I stopped pretending. I stopped fighting the pull toward Apollo. It had become all-consuming, and it was becoming impossible to function without him. Then it happened. It was late afternoon when my husband left for a meeting, and I made my way to the barn once again. I knew exactly what I was doing. I understood the consequences, but there was no turning back. Apollo greeted me as always, and I found myself standing there, gazing into his deep brown eyes, unable to tear myself away. The connection between us seemed to hum in the air, and I could feel his energy, his presence, his silent power surrounding me. I walked toward him, my hands trembling as I reached out to touch his mane. But this time, something was different. This time, there was an intensity in the air, a mutual understanding between us that hadn't been there before. As I ran my fingers through his mane, I felt the tension in my body melt away, the wave of desire crashing over me. My mind couldn't process it anymore. My thoughts were too chaotic, my emotions too raw. Suddenly, I heard a noise, footsteps. My heart stopped, and a surge of panic coursed through me. I pulled away quickly, my breath coming in short gasps, glancing around the barn. But it wasn't my husband's footsteps. It was something else, something that made me freeze. Apollo's eyes widened, his body tensed, but the quiet connection between us didn't break. It was as though time had stopped, and the world held its breath. And then I heard it, the barn door creaking open, the unmistakable voice of my husband. He had come back early. My blood ran cold. I had been caught, not physically, but emotionally. There was no going back from this moment. I stood frozen, uncertain of what to do next. My heart pounded in my chest as I heard him approach the barn, each step echoing in my mind like a countdown. There was no more pretending, no more hiding behind lies. I could feel the weight of the truth settling around me, the consequences of my actions finally catching up to me. When my husband entered the barn, I didn't look at him. I couldn't. He stood in the doorway, silent for a long moment before speaking. "I knew something was wrong," he said, his voice low but steady. I didn't want to believe it, but now I understand. I turned to face him, my heart heavy with shame. The man I had pledged myself to, the man I had once loved with everything I had, was standing there, and I had betrayed him in the most devastating way. "I never wanted this," I whispered, the words barely escaping my lips. But it had happened. He didn't respond. He didn't need to. The pain in his eyes told me everything. There was no easy way to fix what had been broken. No way to erase what had happened between Apollo and me. The story had reached its tragic, irreversible conclusion, and there was no undoing the damage I had caused. My world had shifted, twisted, and broken in ways I couldn't understand. And in that moment, as the silence between us stretched, I realized that no matter what came next, there was no going back to what I had once known. Everything had changed.